Health IT is foundational to precision medicine. We're talking about a need for a wide array of data and thinking of new ways of storing, accessing, and analyzing the data. Data are critical to build knowledge, and it really is about that evidence base and the knowledge base that we need to deliver precision medicine care.
Let's let our pathologists spend a little bit less time screening slides by having imaging that can highlight where they think cancer might be on the slides so they can spend more time talking to the provider. Let's automate the simple stuff so that your physicians can spend more time on the higher cognitive stuff and actually talk to their patients again.
There's a real trust that we have to maintain with our patients and our research participants. This is an opportunity, right? This is a pivotal time for us in this industry to double down on establishing that trust and treating that data with the utmost of privacy.
We want to make sure the information flows where the patient needs it in a secure way, and that's really the underpinning of the information blocking section as well.
And so thinking about that from a design perspective and also thinking about the veterans' experience from a design perspective is going to be critical for the health of virtual care moving forward.
The VA has had a long track record of creating excellent digital experiences. Something we have done recently, though, is unite those experiences into a more cohesive platform that is easier for our customers to find. And so, in fact, I think this year, for the first time, over 1 million people in a single month logged into the patient portal.
All right, good morning and welcome to our Digital Health CXO Tech Forum. If everybody could grab a seat, we're going to kick off here. We had a packed schedule for you this morning, so we're excited for it. My name is Michael Hoffman, and I'm the president of Government CIO Media and Research. Government CIO Media and Research is the online destination for thought leadership and research for the transformation of government IT. Our experienced team collects the best practices and research regarding the advancing technology and management landscape. Hopefully this morning you got to meet some of them during our networking period and got to talk to them about some of the different expertise in areas where they're research. I want to thank you all for deciding to spend your morning with us. I know everybody's time here is valuable, but we're really excited that you chose to be here with us. Hopefully everybody got a chance to experience the brand new location for the International Spy Museum, some of the views and whatnot. Beautiful spot. Really exciting to be here and be able to partner with them on this. So we're really excited to have such a great collection of the federal health IT leadership throughout Washington, D.C. and nationally, across all the agencies, Congress, academics, and industry. Really excited for you guys to be here. We're excited, too, about our lineup and the different leaders that we have sharing some of their best practices and programs from agencies such as Health and Human Services, National Institutes of Health, Veterans Affairs, as well as the FDA in CMS. The inspiration for this morning when my team got together and said, what do we want our next CXO Tech Forum to be focused on, is really about digital health and the exciting new emerging technologies connected with it, whether it be artificial intelligence, data analytics, RPA, and cybersecurity. There's just so many different areas out there right now that are really impacting the way that federal health IT is changing and how fast it's changing. So we wanted to provide an area and a platform where we can have these conversations and talk about it. Before we get started, I wanted to make a few announcements. First, we're live streaming this morning's forum. So for everyone tuning in from home or in the office, hello. We hope everyone in this room and back home watching the live stream can take part on social media as well and be part of the conversation. So if you're sharing anything on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, what have you, please use the hashtag CXOTechForum. We're excited to have that and really get some momentum there to have those conversations and share them this way. I also want to thank this morning's sponsors. I'd first like to thank CVP, who is our gold sponsor this morning. And I'd also like to thank Software AG, Data Robot, Centrify, Denodo, and LexisNexis. Each one of these industry partners have played an important role in making this morning possible. So if we could take a moment and give them a round of applause, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. So a new item that we introduced at our last CXO Tech Forum and is backed by some popular demand is our trivia game that we like to play. We want to make this morning fun for you. So hopefully everybody picked their tables wisely, because your table is now going to be your team. All right. So in between some of the panels and keynotes for this morning, we're going to be sharing trivia questions. The prize for trivia questions are free tickets to the museum, which my team will be handing out based on who has the closest to the answer for one of the trivias. So be watching for that. I'll come up before each one of the panels, and for our last session will be the trivia. So we have 3 trivia questions, so 3 sets of tickets to come out. If you haven't been to the museum yet, it's pretty amazing. So a really fun thing that we like to do here and make a part of it. The last thing I wanted to share is one of the things that is always close to my heart is we always make a donation based on some of the on a portion of the ticket sales to a charity. And in this morning we chose the Children's Inn at NIH to make our donation. Yes, very. So I'm glad to see that quite a few folks know about that charity, and really important for us. So for those that are unaware of the Children's Inn, I wanted to share a little bit about it because I think it is important. The Children's Inn is a residential place-like home for families with children participating in some of the leading-edge research that goes on at the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center based in Bethesda, Maryland. So a really important group there. So I'd really encourage everybody, if you haven't learned a little bit about it, please do. It's really exciting and an important part of it. So without further ado, I'd like to move on to our first keynote session. It's going to be done with Health and Human Services Deputy Secretary Eric Hagen. We're honored to have Deputy Secretary Hagen join us this morning, who will be joined by Government CIO Senior Vice President Aaron Mirsky. As both Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of HHS, Eric Hagen takes a leading role in overseeing agency policy and strategy development. Eric has been instrumental in directing health and medical regulatory guidelines across the federal government, having previously served as the HSS Regulatory Policy Officer from 2003 to 2007. So I'm really excited to see what Eric has to share with us this morning. Got to talk to him a little bit last week on some of the topics. So without further ado, we'll have Aaron and Deputy Secretary join us. Thank you.
That's mine.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Let us get settled. So isn't it great that we have Deputy Secretary Hagen here with us this morning? Thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to join you.
Our event this morning is focused on digital health. It's a very important topic, and HHS is truly a leader in this space and in the world and in our country. And it's an honor to have you here today, and we're excited to learn a little bit more about you and the mission of HHS. So thank you so much. To start things off, we'd love to learn a little bit more about you and your journey, and your journey to DC, your journey to HHS.
Sure. Well, I was born in the farm boy. No, I really was. I was born on a farm, really, down in deep southern Illinois. Left the farm, college, law school, and then I spent a long time in Chicago, back in Illinois, my home state, and I did a lot of healthcare, a lot of sort of healthcare law and a lot of corporate side of things. Then left to, spent one time here on a campaign, did not work out, went back. This is my 3rd time in DC. Then went back to HHS, started out as Deputy General Counsel for Regulations under then General Counsel Alex Azar, who's now Secretary Alex Azar. I was Deputy General Counsel then. I was, when Alex became Deputy Secretary in the 2nd term under Bush, I went along as his kind of chief of staff, principal deputy, and then I was acting deputy secretary then, back to Chicago, back to the law, back to healthcare, and then came back in transition right after the election. And then now I'm confirmed deputy secretary. I was acting secretary for about 4 months after Dr. Price left, but back to my old job, and now under Secretary Alex Azar. So meet the new boss, same as the old boss. But it's a good working relationship, obviously, working together kind of every day for years with the secretary right now, which I think has created a lot of sort of good synergies in that we work very well together in the sense of knowing where each other are in that. And we do have a lot of people who have been at HHS before who've come back in this administration, which is unusual, having been in the Bush administration at HHS. We didn't have very many people who had returned from prior administrations, but in this one we have quite a few. And so there's a lot of familiar faces this time around, which I think has helped a lot of the ways that we coordinate with each other. Yeah.
There are so many topics and questions and areas that we can cover this morning in a short amount of time. And it just really speaks to the mission of HHS.
Yep.
So if you could start by sharing some of the priorities for 2020 for the agency.
Yep. Well, some of them are really just continuing priorities of what we've been doing. Things that are really presidential emphases, like bringing down drug prices, which is a complicated area, but which we're continuing to work on. First drop in retail prescription drug prices in 51 years, but there's a lot more to be done in that area. That's not really a digital health area quite, so I won't elaborate too much on that. Continuing to address the opioids crisis. Again, we've had some initial success in that, the first downturn in drug overdose deaths in 28 years, which is, it's a long way from being fixed, but it's the first downturn in a long time, and actually a concomitant first increase in American life expectancy in 4 years that happened last year. We had 3 years of declining life expectancy, and the main delta was the drug overdose deaths, which is, I think a lot of people find that astonishing, is that there's so many drug overdose deaths that have been rising for so long at such a steep curve that it was actually influencing overall life expectancy, especially considering that so many people who died were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, which meant that overall life expectancy was really dropping. Had not happened since World War I and the Spanish flu. So it had been over 100 years since we had seen that kind of thing happening, and really never in a modern industrialized country. So we're starting to address that, but there are a lot of issues. I mean, everything from, and long-term things, probably 2020, some of the long-term things like the quality initiative that I'm working on. I think we'll see the resolution of a lot of things that we've been working on. I'll talk a little bit, probably, hopefully, about the regulatory sprint, some of the regulatory reforms that we're going to be kind of bringing into being, some long-term things that span administrations, like the continuing work to value-based care, sort of moving from fee-for-service to a value-based model. And that's not particular to this administration. We did it under Bush. The Obama administration carried on a lot of those things, and then we're continuing on that. So this isn't really it's not very much of a partisan thing. We're just continuing kind of the work the department has been doing for 20 years probably at this point.
So can you share a little bit more about the reduction in regulations and how that really spurs innovation and cost reduction?
Yeah, so this has been a real theme here, and HHS, #1 department for deregulation for the last 2 years.
Congrats.
So I think we've put in about a little over $25 billion in regulatory savings so far, and the president had asked for 2 to 1. We've hit over that number in terms of the deregulatory actions we took versus regulation that we put on the books. Really the first time this has been done in the modern administrative state. I was Deputy General Counsel for Regulations, then Regulatory Policy Officer of the department, then Chief Regulatory Officer of the department. Then I was a professor of administrative law and healthcare regulation at Loyola in Chicago in the interim, and a regulatory lawyer. Now I'm Chief Regulatory Officer again. So this is really my weird passion. Only in DC can I kind of share that. There's a number of people here that care about regulation, but it's a big initiative for us and for me personally. So we brought those down, and really, in my opinion, what we've been doing is we're sort of taking barnacles off barnacles in the regulatory regime right now. Things that don't affect anything in many ways. They're just costers. So you look at CMS, they have this meaningful measures initiative, and these are taking off measures that are either universally done, they're topped out, they're not clinically valid anymore, they're obsolete, they're duplicative, and they're going through and just taking off things that nobody thinks ever should have been on. But there really wasn't a process for taking them off. So you just take off measures that we were requiring that nobody thinks are valid anymore. Some of the easy things are getting done right now. And so we're seeing I think a lot of pickup in terms of being able to deburden in that way. And so we're trying to sort of do that across a lot of our agencies where we're trying to look at things like that. One of the things that we also did is that I had all of our regulations put into AI. I had them scanned and looked at by AI. Gave it to one of our consultants and just did some really initial scrubs of not for problems with it, nothing very sophisticated, but looked for terms that were outmoded like telegram or telegraph. Like requirements in the regulations that you communicate with HHS by telegram or telegraph,
right.
or that you put in quadruplicate paper copies or triplicate paper copies, carbon copies. We looked for old terms that really don't have any validity anymore. Places where we had laws that we were referencing that don't exist, had been repealed, cross-references that don't work, orphan regulations that had never been assigned to an agency to carry out, so they're just sitting on the books doing nothing. And so we went on a kind of a scrub through those to kind of take them out. Now, whether that results in reform, it's some similar to what we did in 2017. We got rid of the Y2K regs. There were still technically requirements for reporting on the Y2K crisis of 1999. We had offices that it was in their description, position descriptions of employees that they were supposed to prepare reports on the Y2K crisis 18 years later. So these are examples of just, some of this is cleanup work, some of it is actually moving the needle in terms of like removing requirements that are obsolete on people to continue to work in that area. So
that really speaks well to this group in connecting regulations and digital transformation.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's a great example. Another area where you've had a lot of outreach and focused on innovation is the Deputy Secretary's Innovation and Investment Summit.
Yep. Yeah.
Would you share some of the takeaways from that event and how you work together with industry and private sector?
Yeah, so this is a first of its kind. I brought in investors from the healthcare sector, sort of across the spectrum, from venture capital investors that work in startups to private equity that kind of deal with more mature organizations, onto strategic investors, so sort of large companies that do a lot of purchasing of companies, buy and sell companies in space, to kind of bring them in and say how really meet federal healthcare leadership for the first time. So they're investors in the healthcare space and kind of bring them in. They had never been brought in before. Now, I used to do work in this space, so I wanted to see, I knew that there were reflections. They don't ever really meet or ever talk to the actual regulators or leaders in the federal government. And so I had some issues that I wanted them to sort of help think about. One of them primary was the spottiness of medical technology. Sort of why do some areas go faster and slower? Why are investors attracted to a particular area? Why do they put money in a space and why do they not put money in another space? Why do they put a lot of money, say, in cancer care and very little in dialysis? So, we had seen almost no technological innovation in dialysis in the last 40 years. We've seen a lot of innovation in cancer care. And as I put it to them, I said, take a patient in 1978, this was 2018, on dialysis, bring them forward 40 years, what's the difference in their lives? It's pretty much the same technology. They're looking at a flat screen TV instead of a big box from 1978. They're looking at an iPhone for news instead of a stack of magazines on the table next to them, but otherwise it's remarkably similar technology, a very physically punishing, financially punishing technology, and yet it's pretty much the same as it was in the mid-'70s. Take cancer, take it as a unitary thing, it's not, but, and say, what is somebody who has a diagnosis of cancer? What happens to there? We've solved a lot of cancers. We've prevented a lot of cancers. Some have been converted into really chronic disease states at this point, rather than acute care crisis that is going to kill you at some point. Now there's a difference. Not all cancers, but a lot of money, a lot of innovation has gone into this area, but very little tied to dialysis. Walk us through why, as investors. Why do you make the decisions you do when approaching the healthcare sector? And so they came up with a number of issues that they wanted. Value-based care was one of them. Patient engagement and empowerment. Liberating data to drive value. They really want to talk about the role of data and what we could do as sort of stewards of that federal healthcare data, because we're the largest single repository of healthcare data, but a lot of it's very much locked up. Some for legal reasons, privacy concerns, and some just for no reason whatsoever other than the fact that either sort of somebody doesn't want to share it, or we don't know how to, or we don't know if it would be useful, or no one knows it's there. But, you know, I kind of, whenever I sort of approach, whenever I find out new parts of our data, I always think of the scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark at the end, you know, these just warehouses full of things that nobody knows about, and they're not helping people, but the taxpayers have paid for them. Right. But they're sitting there, kind of caught inside there. And then regulatory approval and reimbursement, this has to do with the old problem of parallel review, where investors kind of both have to go through the FDA process of approval and then years later see if they'll be reimbursed by Medicare. And so there's a two-part, so investors have, when they're looking at medical technology, they want to eventually sell into the Medicare program, which is the largest payer in the government and in the country, they have to go through think ahead. Am I going to get it approved, and am I going to get it paid? Am I going to get paid for it? And they're both two problems of uncertainty. And so we're exploring whether or not we can kind of make the agencies learn to kind of cooperate with each other earlier on to kind of talk that through before and reduce some of the uncertainty. Yes or no, right, before investors get started. So that's been, and we're sort of working on a summary. It was a year-long process, that's all, 4 meetings and talking with them. But it's been really very useful to us to kind of take the lessons and re-inject them back into kind of our policy making.
And those have flowed into new programs like Kidney X and other innovation funds where
exactly.
industry can get involved.
Yes, and it's flowed into things like the executive order that the president sent us about the parallel review process. Like it elevated that issue to the point where like the White House took it and sort of gave it back to us saying, yeah, we do think this is an important issue, and like you all need to figure out how to work this from a kind of internal organizational point of view. And Kidney X and a lot of the innovative things that they have emphasized, and some of the areas like strategic areas where they really kind of kept us. This is an important area for us to go into.
Sure.
Yeah.
From our earlier discussions and preparation, you shared how interoperability is really a key priority for your office.
Yep.
Can you share more with the technologists in the room who love to tackle these type of issues and how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, well, that is one of the, working with Dr. Rucker, who's our national coordinator of health IT, and our office is sort of running point on this in terms of getting the rule into its final form. Obviously, this has attracted a ton of attention in the space, but, and you know, there's lots of people on each side in terms of even the whole project, to be honest. But the Cures Act calls this out. And we're going to carry this rule into finality because we are going to give what the Cures Act calls out, which is that Americans are going to be able to get their health records from their providers on an app on their smartphone for free, all of their health information. Now, what the details are on that, there's a lot of detail on that. One thing about it is that as opposed to some other initiatives, we are not going to be solving this problem technologically in-house. So we are going to be setting standards, technical standards in the rule, as you may have seen, HL7 FHIR standards for the programming and how the APIs are going to function. So we have a common standard, but we're relying on the private sector to develop those apps and to develop the ways of coordinating to get the data that are going to bring them to the department. We're going to develop a trusted exchange framework, and so that the health information networks and exchanges can acquire the information from the providers, and we put in place information blocking penalties. The law calls out probably the stiffest penalty I have seen in law, which is $1 million per violation. So if a health information exchange network or a company that's in this space holds the information back, it's $1 million per occasion, and that's the biggest fine I know of in law. And then we're going to be working on what the provider side of that is going to turn into, but it's a pretty serious thing. We're preparing the exceptions in this rule. The law just says information block, here's the fine. We're preparing exceptions so that people can know, you know, if you do it for patient safety or security or other reasons, we're not going to give you $1 million per piece of data that you held back. So there are exceptions that we're building in so it actually works and we don't end up kind of bringing everybody to a screeching halt with the idea that they're going to rack up billions and billions of dollars of fines very quickly. But that's what the law calls out. So yeah, I think it's going to open a completely different world when the patients have their own longitudinal health record in their hand portably in their own possession. I think that's going to change the world. I think that the walled garden approach, which has been kind of developing into dominance so far, I think that there are challenges to that world that the interoperability rule and the Cures Act, which mandates it, definitely bring into being. But I believe the creativity of the health IT sector will be able to bring this out and develop. And I'm sure, even though it's for free, the basic record, I'm sure people are going to develop values that beyond the requirement of the law that will allow this to develop into a real economy. We're looking forward to it. I mean, as I say, we're setting the technical standards, the exceptions to information blocking, and then our idea is to get out of the way. And the apps are developed out there in the economy. There's no appetite for us to do that in-house.
One more question I know on a lot of people's mind is coronavirus.
Yep.
And could you share more about how HHS is helping protect us from coronavirus and other similar future
Sure.
viruses?
Well, this is obviously a topic that's really top of mind for everybody at the department at this point. I don't have this morning's figures. I'll be getting them later on this morning, but it's over right now in China primarily. It's over 40,000 cases that have been diagnosed, 1,000 plus deaths at this point, almost all in China, and the majority of those, vast majority, in a single province in China. We have 12 cases in the United States total, all of them, 10 of them directly from China, and 2 family members who caught it from their family member. What have we been doing? First, CDC has been, as our sort of public health agency on this, has been doing a ton of outreach to get into state and local health departments and working with the Chinese and other international partners to kind of develop a response here, and also with the WHO and other sort of international partners on this front. So a lot of the areas dealing with the early bringing people back from Wuhan, dealing with the kind of keeping those people in place, figuring out whether they have the disease. I think today they're released. Today is their last day, and I don't think as of yesterday, last night, we didn't have any cases with them, so that's great. There's almost 200 people that we brought out of Wuhan. None of them appear to have been infected, and so I think their quarantine ends today. And so it's going to be a continued process of that, because the airlines pretty much shut down their flights. Partially in response to us talking to them about it, but partially in response just to people not wanting to go over to China. There weren't a lot of people wanting to go there in the middle of a new infectious disease outbreak. It's a problem for us because it's related to SARS and MERS, which are both fairly bad infectious diseases, and it's a novel virus in that we haven't ever had it before, so we're concerned that immunities that have been developed in other diseases really aren't going to work on this disease. So CDC has been front and center. I don't see Dr. Tabak. NIH has been working on the research on understanding the virus and doing a lot on that. CDC developed the first diagnostic kit to help diagnose the virus, to say where it is. FDA did an emergency use authorization, which allowed CDC to send the diagnostic kits out to other labs. And I think we have almost 200 labs now who have access to the kits. So that'll allow the diagnosis to take place to say, is this coronavirus versus is this a flu strain versus SARS, MERS, or whatever else, so that they can actually reliably understand that this is what this is and not another thing. BARDA, which is our biodefense R&D agency, has been working with at least one major pharmaceutical company on a therapeutic on it, so they've sort of ramped up their efforts. And just generally, sort of across the department, ACF has been working. It does repatriation, so they're working on
Everyone at
HHS, even our social services agencies are arranging the flights out for the quarantine people and where they're going to go and their housing, because they know housing and all that world of social services and sort of taking care of people outside of the medical context. So they've been working on all of that and arranging flights and travel. So it's kind of like this is a really all hands on deck.
I just want to thank you for your leadership in this area. You guys have a big job this year.
It is a big job.
I think we set a great tone for the event. We covered a lot of different topics in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
So Deputy Secretary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time, your insight, and I know we're going to have a great event today.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Sure. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. We got some people standing over in the corner over here. We got some seats over here if you want to be a part of it. I would encourage everyone to, because we now have our first trivia question for the day. All right. So everybody get ready for it. All right. So you'll see there's in the center of your table is paper and a pen. We'll get about 60 seconds to get an answer. And if anybody pulls out their iPhone to try to look this up, you're automatically DQ'd. All right? All right. iPhone, any type of phone. Any type of phone. Sorry. Sorry to anybody from Samsung here. Okay. So the trivia question is, ready? According to an Aruba Networks report in 2018, what percentage of healthcare organizations were expected to adopt IoT-based systems by the end of 2019? All right, I'll ask it again. According to an Aruba Networks report in 2018, what percentage of healthcare organizations were expected to adopt IoT-based systems by the end of 2019? So we're looking for a percentage here. Closest without going over wins. No, I don't think you can go over, but I don't know. Closest wins. All right. 60 seconds. James, are you set up to grab? James. Mercel, are you set up to grab answers? Are you good? Are you good? All right. When you have your answer, just hold it up, and we'll our Alex and Aaron and James will walk around and grab them. So we have one over here. We have one over there. Here, I can grab them too. Thank you. Michael, thank you. All right. Table 12, we got an answer. Thank you, Brooke. All right. Got them? All right, let me share with them over here. Anybody else? Last call. Servio, always. Good one. All right. Excellent. Great. James or Aaron and Alex. Go. All right. All right, so let me get back in screen. All right, so our next is going to be our data science and analytics panel. It's going to be moderated by Andrew Underhill, who's Government CIO's Chief Technology Officer. And he's going to be joined by Mishu Tasnam, Executive Director of Digital Services for CMS, Colonel Thomas Cantalina, Chief Health Informatics Officer, Health Military Systems, DHHQ, Dr. Brenda Blunt, Director, Health for CVP, and then Dr. Lawrence Tebek, Principal Deputy Director, National Institutes of Health. If you could all join us on stage, thank you.
So, thank you for joining us. So I'm going to start with Mishu. Thank you for coming. Did you want to quickly introduce yourselves over and above what Mike just did? Or?
Yeah, I'm Mishu Tasneem. I'm the director of our HHS Digital Service team working with U.S. Digital Service. I've come here by route of being an engineer previously, product management, and now I'm serving CMS on several of our interoperability and data sharing initiatives.
Okay.
Good morning, Larry Tabak. I'm the Principal Deputy Director at the National Institutes of Health. The Principal Deputy Director does everything that the Director doesn't want to do. Yeah. So glad to be here.
Good morning, I'm Tom Cantalina. I'm the Chief Health Informatics Officer for the Defense Health Agency, which is basically all three services pulled together to run the military treatment facilities. I'm a family physician by background as well as former computer programmer. It's kind of how I ended up in this position. And my job, while most people think I'm Mr. MHS Genesis, which is rolling out our new instance of Millennium and Dentrix for our hospital systems, I'm also looking at a lot of our data restructuring and engineering as we move forward.
And I am Brenda Blunt, Director of Health at Customer Value Partners, or CVP. And I really focus on bringing the health SME, or subject matter expertise, into our technology solutions for our clients. I'm a nurse by background, but also managed projects at CMS and implemented IT systems there as well.
Thank you. So my name is Andrew Underhill. I'm just here because I have a funny voice. CTO of Government CIO. So start with you, Ms. Yu. Let's talk about human-centered design and how that fits with policy in your work.
Sure. One of the things that we always try to engage with our partner agencies is to make sure we understand the why around why we're designing policy, why we're implementing a new IT system. So we've really introduced this concept of human-centered design at CMS, where we work very closely with them, also at VA, Department of Homeland Security. What we're starting to find is a lot of times folks will write a policy and not actually engage with the end user to see how that policy is impacting their lives. So now we've gotten to a place where we're writing that into contracts where human-centered design, we're asking for designers to be included as part of a labor category. And even if it's not a large breadth of design research that we require, we're asking that our staff partners do a certain level of human-centered design along the entire workflow. So not just the end user, not the patients or the physicians that we impact, but also who's maintaining the software, who's writing the policy, are their cadences in line with each other? So there are humans along the way, and like being very mindful of like the operational process and where the humans are in that workflow is a concept that we've been introducing, and it's been received pretty well.
Mm-hmm. So when I hear about people talking about human-centered design, they're still, in my mind, focused on some of the IT, functional aspects. Are you using behavioral health, behavioral initiatives affecting human-centered design? So they're looking at how people behave in front of IT, and not just how the IT should support the human.
Absolutely. We a lot of times get into places where one office will go and buy a new technology because that's new technology, they got a contract for it, they bought it, and then they realize that their downstream users are using something completely different. I see this all the time with people that are like, well, this is a SaaS shop and this is an R shop. Now we have to create this other shop in between that's going to do this translation in between, as opposed to if they had just, talked to everybody prior, you would have picked your solutions accordingly, allowing for notebooks or other tools to sit on top of it, so you don't have to refactor every time someone goes out and chooses a new technology.
We're an adaptive race, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so how we were talking about the Strides initiative earlier and how that's changing the landscape in terms of the IT that supports it. Would you be able to elaborate on that for the audience?
Sure, happy to. So let me just to start, tell folks that the NIH is the largest public supporter of biomedical research in the world. And we span from most fundamental discovery all the way through clinical trials. About 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to speak to the chancellors of the University of California system, and I was supposed to blue sky. And the blue sky was biomedical research is entering big data. And they laughed. And I found that an odd reaction, but it turns out that most of them were astrophysicists. And so they sort of poo-pooed the biomedical research entry into, quote, big data. Fast forward to today, and biomedical research is now very much mainstream in the so-called big data revolution. So Strides is really one way that we have tried to engage and enable our biomedical research community. This is a partnership with AWS and Google at the moment. We hope to add additional partners. It allows us to access storage, compute, and most importantly, training and the most modern cutting-edge cloud opportunities. We've been able to move about 30 petabytes of biomedical research data into the cloud already. That makes it probably the largest biomedical research data set. What we're now doing is working through the ways of computing across very disparate sets, things like genomics, things like imaging, things like electronic health records, all the things that everybody aspires to do, but still, finds it challenging. So by partnering with the private sector, we really are able to move our agenda forward. It's not something that we can do in isolation of the private sector.
Cool. Thank you. So, Colonel, from the MHS and the Genesis perspective, how do you see data analytics transforming how EHRs are used?
I think I'm going to start with a little story on how data can transform the way you care for a patient or improve the patient experience. Something that we didn't realize just a few short years ago was possible, and we're starting to get in now with this project. I like to think data as sort of the red blood cells of an enterprise. They bring oxygen everywhere, yet if they're by themselves, they mean absolutely nothing. So with that, I was at one of our larger facilities. They were having a problem with patients calling in and getting appointments. In fact, their average wait time on the phone line was 18 minutes, if you can imagine that. And in some ways you can, in other ways you're like, that's ridiculous in today's modern world. And they had been trying to throw all kinds of things at it for the past literally 5 years trying to fix it. And they were just about to let a contract to hire 5 more people. And so I said, oh, let me take a look at it. And I said, well, what's the data show? And they said, what data? What do you mean data? Now, granted, we didn't have a nice integrated system like we have today. We had data in multiple different places. So we took a 2-step approach, and I won't go into all the details. But the first step, looking at the data and identifying what the problem actually was, we decreased it to about 5 minutes average wait time. And I said, well, what about the other 2 data sets we need to look at? And they're like, here's the EHR system that's showing you the appointment system. You should have enough there. I said, no, that's not human behavior and how people interact with it. That's what I need to know so that we can focus things. So we added the second set of data, created a standard dashboard or monitoring system so that we could target our efforts on what we needed to prove and restructure things. And by February, 6 months after we started the project, our average wait time was 28 seconds. And it stayed that way for the 4 years I was in command of that facility. Because we kept that data flowing and integrated so that people could use it to make sense. And I think that's where we started to realize us as the MHS and as a health system, 3 services really doing the same thing, needed to start standardizing the way we took an approach to the use of data so that it wasn't just at one MTF, military treatment facility, or one hospital, that you had 28 seconds, yet you go to the next state and you're at another facility and it's back up to the 10 minutes. We need to make that standard so no matter what door you walk in or what phone you pick up to call for an appointment, it's the same thing. And that's really where we're driving with this standardization around MHS Genesis going forward.
How is that being implemented, that standardization across?
So do we have another 3 hours?
In 3 words.
I'll try to keep it short. The really bottom line is when they did the acquisition memo and designed how they're going forward, they did something they never did before, is they said, we will have a single voice of the customer. We will have a functional champion that will say, this is what we need, and you need to make sure you live up to that, and it's a senior clinician. It's actually a 2-star general. My boss, General Payne, is the current functional champion. I'm the deputy functional champion, which drives the technology to solve the problem, which is caring for patient, helping the user care for patients. So that's really been the pivot point. So instead of each facility or each service or the multiple voices coming at the vendor saying we want it this way or that way, it's one voice work through to say this is what we need so they can target their efforts to make things better. And then we have stood up since that time my office, which is the Office of the Health Informatics, where we started to realize we do need to integrate people, process, and technology. You can't do one without the other 2. The moment you step away from any one of them, it starts to fall apart, as you pointed out very clearly. So yes, everybody wants to focus on the shiny object, the shiny object syndrome, as they say, the technology, but that's usually not the issue. It's usually either training the people and getting them to understand or standardizing the workflow, the process, the sequence of events that need to occur to care for the patient. So it's the same everywhere you go. And that's the one thing, probably the biggest thing we've uncovered with this project is even within one facility, the variation was so huge, it's no wonder we couldn't fix anything. You can't improve random. So you have to create a standard, and then you can start creating that constant process improvement.
Have a baseline to improve, right?
Exactly.
Right. So I think you mentioned something interesting. It's the people. The people are staff, nurses, doctors, patients, veterans, caregivers. There's a lot of variety there. Dr. Blunt, your focus is on people and EHRs. How does analytics help support the new future of patient-centered care and precision medicine, or how do analytics help the person?
So when done well, analytics supports healthcare delivery by really effectuating the analysis and augmenting what providers know. So what nurses know, what physicians see, what home health aides see. The technology, again, when implemented based on the people and the actual use cases for that implementation, the technology augments that. It streamlines care. It gets the right care at the right time. What we fail to do a lot of times, though, is have been mentioned, we implement technology solutions without looking at the end users and the impacts that we really want to get out of it. We hear, oh, let's implement an AI solution. Let's predict readmissions. Well, that's great, but have you thought about where you're going to use that information, who's going to use that information, and how are you getting that data to that person? Whether it be an alert to a patient's family member or an alert to a primary care physician, that work stream is going to look different, and how that information needs to come in is going to look different, as well as the sources of data going into that model. So there's a lot based on social determinants of health, genomic data, a lot of past medical claims, so places where CMS and other payers, their data can come into play, wearables, Internet of Things, all of these data sources, if we can merge them and we can put them together and create solutions based on the people throughout the life cycle. So the data scientists who have to analyze the data from the beginning, those who are going to have to do the O&M of the systems and the algorithms moving forward, as well as the health systems, the payers, and ultimately the patients and families. What does the data mean to them, and how do they want to receive it?
So what technologies are really impacting the patient, today, and which technologies do you feel are failing right now and could be improved?
So that's a dangerous question, because anything I tell you today is going to change tomorrow, right?
Right.
So it's really, I think, to look at the right technologies. It's about going back to what do you need to do with the data? And, AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, they each have their strengths, and you have to pick what you want to do with the data first, and then pick the right tools and technologies. And there's not one answer. Sometimes you're going to pick 2 or 3 technologies to build the right solution, whether it's open source or it's off the shelf. It's variable, but that's where identifying your end users, identifying the people along the way is really important to picking the right solution, and you're not force-fitting a solution into a scenario.
Right. So back to you and to that point, how do we identify the emerging technologies that are going to fill the gaps that maybe are out there today?
I absolutely agree with that. Is focusing in on a technology is where we see people tripping up, as opposed to focusing in on the concepts of data sharing and the availability of data. If anyone here is a photographer, the common saying in the photography community is the best camera is the one that you have with you, right? Not the fancy one with the $10,000 lens.
This one here.
Yeah, exactly. It can be that. It can be a wind up. It's whichever one you have with you in the moment. So the best data is the one that is available to you. If everybody is building data in their own silos, you have no access to that data, and it is basically defunct at that point. You might as well just not build technology on top of it. So I think the most important thing to consider with data is I am using this data and like ingesting it or putting it out downstream, who is using that data, and am I making it easy for them to use that data, is really like the biggest driver that I can think of. We all build technology and there's always a shiny thing coming up. There's AI, there's machine learning, now there's robotic process automation, but just stepping back to say like, okay, like here are the things that I can do with my data, but am I making that data available? One of the things that we're learning is like, while we're starting to build out APIs at CMS, taking this claims data, we are piloting with APIs and sharing that with the doctors' EMRs so that they have access. But as we start to do these pilot integrations, we're realizing different doctors want to see different things on their screens. And so being the technologist in the room, you have to kind of take a step back and say, you know what, I can't solve this for you. I'm going to make the data available to you, and you should solve the rest of the problem for yourself, because everybody's problem is unique. And I think that's where, as a technology implementer group, you have to be very mindful of that, of I'm making this available to you, do what you need for your custom application.
And I'll just add to that, one of the things that we do and really focus on is doing an assessment at the beginning of a project. So make sure, we have the statement of work across government. We know there's a statement of work, but then there's a lot of unstated needs. Then there's, what does a client really want? And so we go in and really spend a few weeks getting to know that, getting to understand who the stakeholders are and what their different visions are, and creating one solid vision so that in executing forward, we make sure we're aligning every step of the way, and then we periodically come back and revisit, because over a 5-year project, it's going to shift, it's going to change as new technologies emerge, as new data emerges, as senior leadership changes. So we continue to reassess so that you stay on target.
I frequently have a phrase that I bring to my team is define the problem before you try to solve it. Don't bring a solution and try to find a problem.
Yeah. You say that to Google, So I was wondering, how do you prioritize all the work that's coming in? Because as you're engaging the population instead of a requirements analyst or a business analyst, you've got so many different perspectives and lenses, views of the world. They all have different priorities, which is all the highest priority a lot of the time. How do you manage that?
I think what we try to do is really, how can you incrementally increase that instead of collecting all of the requirements and spending 6 months collecting requirements, and then you go out into the field and realize that like 90% of the requirements are defunct. Starting out with doing user research at the place where they are doing the work is probably the most critical. And then you identify what the blockers are and you prioritize based on, if I unblock here, you can continue that stream of work while I unblock something else. That's sort of the process that we take for prioritization. But I think meeting the users where they're doing the work is where you get this like contextual awareness. I'll give a story about like the quality payment program. When the MACRA Act was released, we were told that physicians have to submit their quality information to CMS. The folklore was that we have to talk to physicians. All physicians have to submit this data. When you go in and you start talking to the users, physicians are like, I don't have time for this, right? I have 3 minutes with my patients. When I have 3 minutes, I'm not going to spend 2 of those minutes, writing down my quality metrics and submitting that to CMS. You dig a little deeper and you realize it's actually their billing offices that are doing it. You start talking to the billing office and they're like, I don't want to do this one patient at a time. I want to do this at the end of the week on a Friday report and send it in bulk, right? So that immediately changed all of our technology solutions and implications for that. Had we gone and written the requirements up front, we would have absolutely missed the boat because our end user was different.
Are we using any analytics to help support that process?
Once we collect the data, yeah.
Okay.
And I think that is one really important thing. A lot of data initiatives that we take on, we collect all of this data, we look at it and we're like, oh, this data is garbage, there's data quality issues, and then we throw the project aside. I think the key thing is, yes, your data is garbage. Now what do you do to increase the quality of the data? Because the first time you look at data, it is going to be nonsense. You're going to realize where there are no standards. You're going to realize the operational issues that resulted in getting that garbage data in, what do you do with the process? Like you were saying, process, people, and technology have to be coupled. Looking at your garbage data is the first step in like identifying and diagnosing where the process issues are. So don't throw away garbage data. It is valuable.
Well, it all has meaning, right? Even if it's garbage. Indicates some other problem.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on to NIH and the analytics initiatives that you have over there. How is data analytics helping with with NIH's initiatives?
Well, now I need the 3 hours, but I won't. So let me give you a couple of examples. So when you're born 100% human, and when you die, you're 90% bacterial. So what that means is that you are really a superorganism. Your humanity coupled with the microorganisms that inhabit all surfaces of your body, inside and outside. We call that the microbiome. So if you think of the complexity of the human genome and now superimpose upon that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of different microorganisms, many of which are unknown. They've never been cultivated before. And now you have a massive analytical problem. And we use these approaches to deconvolute all of that. So you can, for example, by sequencing all those unknown microorganisms, interrogate databases and decide what the lifestyle of each of those microorganisms is. Why is that important? Your microbiome may be affecting your normal physiology. It may be affecting what medical interventions you're taking. It may be affecting your immune system. There are all sorts of things it could be affecting. And without the analytical tools that we now have at our disposal, there's no way that we could even think about attacking that. I'll give you a second example, one which is relatively new. If you think back, those of you who were tortured by introductory chemistry, chemical space. So you remember learning about some carbon bonds and oxygen and so forth. The chemical space is vast. It's about 10 to the 60th, but we only know an infinitesimal amount of what that chemical space looks like. And as we search for new interventions, we've got to be able to interrogate that unknown chemical space. Well, the traditional way of doing that is round up a bunch of friendly organic chemists and set them to work to create bizarre new compounds that may or may not have any value added. We can now do that through simulation, through artificial intelligence feeding back on itself and learning whether or not a particular potential synthetic pathway makes sense or not. And by doing the whole thing in silico, you can rapidly move things along to the point of then being able to engage your friendly medicinal chemist to do some, fancy modification. I guess the final example that I will give you is one that you're probably most familiar with, and that's image analysis. So when people think about medical application of things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, they go right to radiography. And it is true that there are now a number of examples where the radiologist is being helped a great deal by AI and machine learning approaches. But that will go well beyond just simple radiography and will venture into CAT scans and PET scans and MRIs and so forth. So we're not ready to give up radiology just yet, but as an adjunct, these are very, very valuable things. And in common with my colleagues on the panel, the key to that is great curated data. If you hide and hoard the data, it's of no value. If you make the data findable, accessible, and usable, then you really have the opportunity to move things forward. So that's just a few examples of some of the things we're using.
Yeah, how are you sharing that data with the community? Because I used to work for an image analysis company, and behind the big company name, there are two people looking at the data,
Right.
building the algorithms, doing the segmentation and whatnot. So, if you free the data to the community, I think there's some huge advantages.
So we have now created public stores where data can be deposited and interrogated freely. Obviously, where we have patient identifiables, you have to have a second level of consideration. But even in that circumstance, once vetted, there are ways of sharing data in a way that heretofore we had not been doing. I think, at least in science, the real advances are being made at the interface of the traditional disciplines, and the only way you can empower and enable that is by getting people from the various different disciplines to share their data across those disciplines. And so that's what the goal is.
Sorry, it was my fault. Moving on. Data analysis in Genesis. Where do you see the advances for patient care occurring?
Oh, I see a lot of advances, because what I like to say about data is it's only as good as it reflects reality. If the data says something, then what's happening at the bedside, we're not going to be able to improve care. I want to go down the path he was on in defining variables. That's the exciting stuff. But the practical application is, if we're not collecting data correctly, no matter how we analyze it, we're not going to improve the way we practice care. So as we go down the path of MHS Genesis, now instead of having 7 different systems, we now have one system that pulls the data together. And instead of having multiple different parties affect the user interface in the way the data is collected, we have one process for that to occur. So I literally have a team that's focused on, okay, how do we interact with the user as they're caring for the patient and collect that data set? And then I interact with the team that's analyzing the data set, and they say, well, this is what we're seeing. And I'll go back and say, is that reflecting reality, and what do we need to change? And I'll literally change a drop down in a week to improve the quality of the data that gets brought in, so we have a better analytic platform, and just keep that cycle going to improve the quality. And this comes out, a real quick historical story is, HEDIS metrics is a big measure of outcome. It's become a standard throughout our industry. And when I was at a much lower level, running a clinic, we would always be beat up on our HEDIS measures. I would look at my team and what they're doing and the measures we were looking at. I said, but it looks good in this set. What I come to find out later is the data set they were using to calculate the measures at headquarters was pulled a completely different way than the data set we were using to manage our patients. So you were basically fixing things over here, but nobody over here knew it, and so you're being beat up. Everything was a nail, everything was a nail because all I had was a hammer. So you felt like you never made any progress. So we transitioned that, and now the data that we collect to work on managing the individual patients is the same data set that the analysts do to build the HEDIS metrics to give you the scorecard on how you're going, rather than 2 different ones, so you can actually see progress moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the big problems with research in the past is being able to get that to the clinician in the clinical workflows. So Dr. Blunt, what are we doing to change and enhance the clinical workflows and to make, so that there's impact on the patient from all the research that we're doing?
So again, it comes back to how are you designing the system and implementing it, right? And I would argue HEDIS measures are great. CMS has a whole host of other quality measures that we report on, and they serve our purpose. So I'm definitely not saying that. But to the patient sitting on that bed, they don't care what your HEDIS scores are. And they may not want the textbook answer for what they should be doing as far as an intervention, because their life may not allow them to meet what a textbook says they should do for their diabetes or their high blood pressure. So at the end of the day, the clinicians still have to have some ability to look at the data, understand what's important, what the data is capturing, but ultimately customize that plan of care for that patient sitting in front of them. And we need to get back to focusing on patient-centered care. So it's great if you've counseled your patient on a flu vaccine, but if they've had a life experience that they don't want their flu vaccine or they don't want the pneumonia vaccine, the provider shouldn't be penalized for that, right? Because that's a patient's choice, and we can't force patients into textbook answers and into quality measure answers. So we really need to allow the systems to build in the information into the clinical workflows, without overwhelming providers. So we've gone from bedside alarms and alarm fatigue there to now alert fatigue on EHRs. And you can't get through your patient appointment without, 20 alarms. Did you ask this? Did you do this? Did you do this? Let providers do their job. They didn't become providers to do data entry. They became providers to care for their patients. Nurses became nurses to care for patients. Same with any other medical profession that you put in that mix. So we've got to tailor the data analysis and the signals coming out of EHRs to what the provider needs to do for that specific patient in front of them. And that's going to take a little bit. We're not there. And I think we have a long way to go still to do that, as well as training workforce. So there is a people aspect. So even the best built system with the most information, we have to address human behavior on that side as well.
Okay, so thank you very much. We're out of time. We got through half of the questions that I had.
Pretty good.
That was good, was it? Okay. So over to you, Mike.
You good? All right. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, can we get a round of applause? Fantastic panel. Fantastic group. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you so much. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Next, we're going to move on to our congressional interview. I promised the trivia answer was going to come right after this. But we're so honored to have Congressman Michael Burgess join us this morning. He's going to be joined by former Congressman Jeff Miller, who's the former chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee. So Dr. Burgess has represented the 26th District of Texas since 2003 and serves as the ranking member of the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health and is the chair of the Congressional Health Caucus. He's a graduate of the University of Texas Health Science Center of Houston, and he practiced medicine for almost 30 years before being elected to Congress. So we're really excited to have both Congressman Burgess join us and do a sit-down interview with Congressman Miller to give a perspective on serving as leadership for both with HHS as well as Viva A from a House perspective. So as an introduction for former Congressman Miller, he served as a representative for Florida's 1st Congressional District from 2001 to 2017. It was previously a member of the Florida House of Representatives from 1998 to 2001. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Congressman Burgess and Congressman Miller to the stage. Thank you. All right, we'll let you two take it from here.
Thank you very much, Michael. We appreciate it. It's a pleasure to see everybody today, and most importantly for me, it's a pleasure to see a former colleague, Dr. Burgess, who a lot of us would go to for information and advice on bills and legislation. And he's been invited today to talk about a little bit about how the healthcare world has changed in a relatively short period of time from when he began practicing as a physician a couple of years ago. And I think because we're talking about IT, let's just dive right into it and talk about what it has meant to physicians from your vantage point with the change in IT.
I need to warn you, I'm wearing a wire.
Understood.
So, well, Affordable Care Act passed 10 years ago. In fact, March will be the 10-year anniversary. But one of the things we forget is that last year at this time was the 10-year anniversary for a bill called the Stimulus Bill. That was the AARA, which actually contained the language that ended up becoming the appropriation for putting computer terminals in doctors' offices. And when I talk to groups of physicians, I mean, that one thing, talk about something that's transformative and maybe not in a good direction. There was a doctor I talked to in Iowa one day, said, I just remember it so well, and the next thing I know, I'm no longer a doctor, I'm a data entry clerk. So the technology that was available, and to some degree is still available, is not strictly user-friendly as far as physicians are concerned. And we've all had the experience, we go and see our doctor, and next thing they do is turn their back to you and start typing into a keypad. Well, I mean, I was always taught, look at your patient, you evaluate, the evaluation is sort of ongoing the entire time you're there having that doctor-patient encounter. So it did put an additional layer in there that many practicing physicians weren't ready for. On the plus side, we've all got bad handwriting, the ability to get a medical record from one place to the other. I mean, I did my residency at Parkland Hospital. There was nothing worse than 10, 11 o'clock at night, a patient comes in. She's been going to our Parkland outpatient clinics at one of the remote facilities, and they literally physically cart the charts up there every night, bring them up the elevator, and you go in to retrieve her chart, and it's not there because it's probably on someone's desk back in the clinic, which is locked up, and no one can get it for you. So that's a problem. And now with electronic health records, of course, that problem doesn't exist anymore. So are there positives? For sure, there are positives. And then, of course, one of the big things we're grappling with and will continue to grapple with, I suspect, for some time, are the whole issues around privacy and the fact that different states are coming up with different privacy regimens that other states question, do I have to follow that, or can we do our own thing, or is there going to be a federal standard that's imposed at some point? So before I make that investment, before I do that time and training, are you going to do something at the federal level? And that's something that sort of defied any effort at compromise for some time. The whole issue around privacy is one that, well, even before the stimulus bill passed, that was one of the one stumbling blocks to even getting to a place where you could have electronic health records. In fact, Ron Johnson, who was the head of Aetna in health insurance in 2007, I heard him give a talk, and he said, where you think of us as a health insurance company, we're actually a software company. We're like the second largest software company in the country. And I asked him afterwards, I said, well, what do you need from us as policymakers? What would you need from us to make things work? And he said, well, we're going to need some regulatory relief on the Stark Law. We're going to need some liability protection because we can't just be getting sued every time we turn around. And you've got to decide what you mean by privacy and not change your mind every 3 months. So unfortunately, those three conditions are still out there and haven't been met. Stark Law still exists, even though Pete Stark, rest his soul, is no longer with us, but the Stark Law is. And the question of liability is one that has not been resolved, but privacy remains the big obstacle.
One of the things that we battle with all the time, and I know you still do on the committee, and that is, what is the role of government in technology innovation? You know, does the government step out of the way and let the private sector do it? Do we help drive it? You know, what's the role?
Well, the answer is both, obviously, and we are, we're blessed in this country. We're like the engine of innovation for the world in many instances. Still, is there a place for a regulatory touch, albeit a light regulatory touch? And the answer is yes. All the hearings we had around, as medical apps and health apps started to become a thing a few years ago, and then there was concern. Is the Food and Drug Administration going to actually interpose its regimen on these development of these electronic apps? There was a decision made that the FDA would sort of take a hands-off approach and monitor the situation. I think that's been good. I think that's been helpful. I think that has allowed the health monitor apps to continue to be developed. I mean, I've got an EKG on my iPhone. That's great. When I was in practice, I didn't know that would even be possible, but it is today. And again, the FDA was pretty straightforward in allowing that. They actually evaluated that as a predicate device. EKGs were already allowed, so the fact that you could carry one in your pocket or in your belt holster was, while it was a novel concept, the technology itself really wasn't all that novel.
As we look at artificial intelligence now and the growth of it, certainly in the medical field, you have a lot of people that still say, they want a human being making that decision. So from an ethical standpoint, how does Congress make sure that AI is being used in appropriate ways?
Well, and that is a tall order, and it is so important. I think of a disease like type 1 diabetes, and it is one that lends itself to artificial intelligence as part of one of the principal management tools. You might even ask the question, why would you want a person involved in that? It's a minute-by-minute protocol, and artificial intelligence is probably better suited to deliver that, because you're not going to have your doctor monitoring your glucose literally minute by minute all through the day and night. Surely there are things we haven't even thought of that could be problems, and clearly the policymaker will have to still be involved, and there will have to be various evaluations. My concern is always, I want the technology. If there's a better way to handle type 1 diabetes, and we've got all of the tools and technology today, then let's do it. Let's get it to people. The creation of the artificial pancreas, which is really nothing more than a continuous glucose monitor and an insulin pump, and they communicate with each other. That took forever to get that through the FDA. And why? I mean, these technologies were not that new, but it was the combining of them that seemed to be the stumbling block at the agency. So I recognize that the regulatory agencies can be problematic at the same time, and certainly vis-a-vis the problems with privacy, the problems with hacking. You certainly don't want someone hacking into your insulin pump. That could be well, I guess Dick Cheney was the one who, you remember when he was on a stage and he had a pacemaker in or something, and someone who could hack into his pacemaker could create all kinds of international havoc. So you do have to be careful, obviously, with that aspect of regulation. Can I just share with you, on Friday, I had 2 classified briefings. One was on the problem with cybersecurity and the issues surrounding cybersecurity, was more in the delivering electricity to customers in that space rather than the healthcare space, but still some of the things they were talking about were very concerning. And then the other hearing I had, or classified briefing I had, was on the coronavirus. And I honestly can't tell you which one scared me more, but I'll just share with you. They both scared me. I mean, there are significant things, significant risks out there in the world, and it's as someone, and you know this because you were there, I mean, someone who sits as a policymaker in Washington, D.C., that concerns me. There are going to be all of different types of situations that require our response, and you just pray that you always make the right one.
And I think the most important thing on the coronavirus is making sure that we are able, the United States, to stay ahead of what's going on. And I know, are you having weekly updates or briefings, or how are you being informed?
That hasn't been structural, but it's what's evolved. And I think that's appropriate. I mean, in the past 2 weeks, we went from less than 100 deaths to over 1,000 in again, less than 14 days' time. Case rate was under 7,000 10 days ago, and it's in excess of 30,000 now. I mean, it is clearly a very rapidly evolving situation. I think China made the right decision to quarantine an entire city of 10 million people. And that's pretty startling when you stop and think about it. And it's a city of 10 million people that nobody knew existed. That was startling also. But the downside of that is there's also an information blackout. So no one really is reporting what's happening at the street level. And I mean, I'm like the rest of you, I see stuff on blogs and Twitter of things that sound pretty desperate. And that concerns me, that the flow of information is not coming back to us. I think, if I understand correctly, World Health Organization has finally been allowed to participate in what's going on over there, and I think that's a good thing. And I know there are great people at our CDC that in a heartbeat would be on a plane over there, and that's,
if they're allowed.
Yeah, if they're allowed. But they want to do. They just as we the DR Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, with the Ebola crisis that was there. I mean, keeping out the public health people, even when it would be to your benefit, that's something that I just don't understand. And I will tell you, I also don't understand someone at the CDC says, yeah, send me into that Ebola area, send me into that coronavirus area. You got to love people like that are willing to literally put themselves in peril in order to do their job, which they see as benefiting all of the rest of us. That's really a different type of individual who can do those jobs.
We've just got a couple of minutes left, and I do want to say thank you to the congressman because he was able to wedge this in to a speech with AMA, and he's got, I guess, an autonomous vehicle hearing coming up in just a few minutes. But
yeah, I've got a self-driving car waiting for me up here.
Does your staff know that?
Just kidding.
I guess one of the things that I want you to talk a little bit about, you hear about caucuses all the time on the Hill, this caucus, that caucus, but there is a health IT caucus and on the Hill, and they do good work in providing information to the members. Can you talk a little bit to this audience about what a caucus's use is and how important it is?
Well, first off, when you're in the minority, the caucus becomes extremely useful because as a member of the minority party in Congress, I don't get to set the hearings. I don't get to call the witnesses. You're just doing whatever is dictated by the majority. But in a caucus environment, you actually can set up a roundtable or briefing. Correct, it doesn't have quite the same impact as a congressional hearing. There's not an official transcript, but you can get a lot of information to members pretty efficiently through the caucus method. And I used that a lot in the years when we were in the minority before, 2007 to 2011, to be able to update people on various aspects of health policy. I will say this also, and when I was the chairman of the health subcommittee, the last hearing that I did as chairman in December of 2018 was get Dr. Rucker to come in and talk to us about this proposed rule that he had come up with and was sending down to the Office of Management of the Budget to get the approval to release it for comment. It's now, as you know, out there for comment. But we should, my opinion, we as the Committee of Jurisdiction should do a lot more of that. We haven't done much this year at all with what's going on at the Office of National Coordinator of Health Information Technology. And we should, because it is our jurisdiction and it affects literally everyone in the country.
Well, I just want to say thank you again for wedging us in. The seconds are ticking off. I think it's important that everybody understand this is a guy that, was a physician, an OBGYN, that had no desire or sight set on being a member of Congress. And the opportunity presented himself. He stepped forward, and his constituents elected him to come to Congress. And he is exactly, I think, what the founders of this country wanted, and that is somebody that wasn't a career politician, that worked in the field, that understood what he was doing. He's brought a lot of expertise, and I want to say thank you very much for what you do on the Hill, and thanks for coming here this morning.
Well, you're very kind, Jeff. I used to make fun of people like me. And, now I recognize that it is an important role we play. But thank you all very much. I appreciate you letting me be here. You had a panel of experts here just a few minutes ago, and then you had me, so kind of balanced out the morning. Expert, non-expert.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim.
All right. Thank you very much for the time.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Excellent. Thanks. Okay. Well, thank you very much to the Congressman for joining us. He really made it a point of his schedule to be here, so fantastic that he was able to share some on that. So, without further ado, we will do the answer to the trivia question. I know everybody was waiting. Who is the winner? So the winner so the question was, what percentage of healthcare organizations were expected to adopt IoT-based systems by the end of 2019? And the correct answer was 87%. So we had a lot of close answers, but the winner is Table 6, which was only one off with 86%. And they're the closest ones to me, so I didn't see anybody pull out a phone. So there you go. Aaron, if you could share with them the tickets. So we are going to, before our next panel, we are going to do our second trivia. So if everybody can huddle with their teams or tables. The question is going to be a security-focused one because that is the next panel that we have. So the question is, according to Malwarebytes, what was the percent increase in ransomware attacks on healthcare institutions from 2018 to 2019? So it's another percentage answer. What was the percent increase in ransomware attacks on healthcare institutions from 2018 to 2019. Okay. We have 60 seconds. All right. When you have your answer, put it up, and me and my team will grab them. All right. All right. Thank you, Liz. Here, I'll hand these to Alex. Okay. Thank you very much. All right. Anybody else? Yes. All right, Servio. There you go. Here. All right. All right, last call. Oh, okay, table 5. Oh, okay. Oh, John. There you go. Excellent. Okay. All right. So our next panel discussion is going to be focused on data management and security. We're excited about this one because we have a great collection of experts from HHS, CMS, as well as Veterans Affairs. So it's going to be moderated by our managing editor for Government CIO Media and Research, Amy Kluber. And she's going to be joined by 3 speakers: Robert Owens, Deputy Inspector General for Management and Policy at OIG, HHS; Jeff Grant, Deputy Director for Operations at the Center for Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight at CMS; and Jason Glanville, Director of Product Strategy, Project Special Forces at Veterans Affairs. We did have one other speaker who will not be able to, unfortunately, join us, Suzanne Schwartz. She's over at FDA. Unfortunately, she got called in for the coronavirus response. So she had a good excuse. All right. So if Amy and the speakers could join us, it would be great. Thank you.
All right. Hey, everybody. So to close out our panels of the day, before we see the HHS CIO speak, we're going to get into a little bit more about the data management at some of these agencies, and as well as the security issues that come with that. So we know who these guys are. Let's open it up with more of kind of a general question just to break the ice. What are some of the data management challenges that government is faced with today in the healthcare space? And we'll start with Robert.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning. My name is Robert Owens from the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of the Inspector General. And our mission is to protect the programs at HHS. And to do that, we rely heavily on data across the organization. So one of our challenges is to A, access that data, and B, make sure we secure it. And that we'll talk a little bit more about that during the panel.
Jeff.
And I'm Jeff Grant. I am effectively the COO of healthcare.gov within CMS. And I would say the general challenge you face in all data spaces is the ability of the business to be able to communicate adequately with the tech experts so that tech solutions actually are targeted toward the business needs. I feel there's always this kind of conversation of talking past each other where the business is insufficiently tech savvy and the tech side is insufficiently business savvy that leads to unsatisfactory solutions at times.
Jason.
Good morning, last but not least. So Jason Glanville, Director of Product Strategy for Project Special Forces at Veterans Affairs. So specifically within the Lighthouse API program, we're looking to actually make data enabled, open, and yet secure to help drive technology innovation within our sphere.
All right. So with Lighthouse being the VA's execution of the open data strategy, how is it meeting the agency's goals with regard to how you are delivering care to veterans?
So a critical part within healthcare is not only having the continuity of care and a consistent care plan across a distributed healthcare system, but a key component also is empowering the patient to be part of the conversation, to be part of the decision making, the consultation, to be aware of what's going on, especially as healthcare becomes more complex, with advent of new medications, new technologies, new value-based care models. And so the Lighthouse API program, the health API that we have out there helps provide digital access to our veterans that they can then access and securely share their information with trusted technology partners to help to set, manage, and achieve their own goals.
And Jeff, you mentioned your data strategy is part of the overall IT modernization strategy at your office. What is that strategy? What is its aims?
Okay, sure. It's kind of odd when you think about us being, having stood up a system in 2013 for a launch in 2014 that we're already talking about a modernization. But if you understand how we were born, you would understand why that is necessary. This was it is a huge endeavor to set up an eligibility process. It was the first one for CMS. CMS gets eligibility for Medicare from SSA. They get eligibility in the Medicaid side. The Medicaid states do it. They're aware of what happens there, but they don't actually actively manage eligibility processes. Then you have an entire enrollment process. You have a number of complicating factors around not being a federal health insurance program and doing a whole bunch of operations for the first time and building tech to support those. So what you end up doing is you build up what you initially envision, and then you find out what you really need to do, and you keep kind of throwing things onto something that you built that was not designed for this full range of scope that you have. And so one example would be enrollment data. And we knew we had a challenge with it, but we weren't able to work our minds around how to deal with the challenge. But when you enroll people in private insurance coverage through a central entity, you have your own central version of what that enrollment is. And then you send it out to a bunch of insurance companies who interact with these people who have life events that happen, and sometimes those life events are reported to us. And sometimes we're kind of like hotels.com to them. You get your hotel room from hotels.com, but when you want to access the minibar, you don't go back to hotels.com, you go to the hotel. If you want to change anything, you're dealing with the hotel at that point. So you start dealing with the insurance company, and we start getting out of sync. And so we have to synchronize that data. So we built processes to do that, to send files out to them, to get files in from them. That becomes an analytic process that's built to the side of the exchange. And then we have another contractor that deals with all of the fallout from payment. And a discrepancy on payment is actually an argument about the facts of enrollment that led to payment. And they build out their own process, and they start getting the same data files that the reconciliation contractor. We pass those downstream to them to help them understand the world and make sense of payment disputes. And all of a sudden, you start proliferating enrollment data all over the place as you built out different processes out of necessity, but you didn't have this master plan built out when you designed your data model. So we're now looking at our enrollment data model and saying, you know, we've dispersed a lot of data. We could probably centralize it, but we're going to have to wrap our heads around every place this data is used and figure out a strategy that allows everybody to do their business process the way they need to do it, but we can do it in a much more integrated fashion so everybody can see the same facts as they change. So we are invested in a multi-year effort. Some of you may have heard of the MidCap project. This will be a central focus of the MidCap project, is kind of aggregating this data and figuring out how to quit passing files back and forth and actually start communicating with one integrated data repository.
Great. Now, Robert, at OIG, you are responsible for delivering to the overall department data in support of its use in analytics. So how are you strategizing around that?
So one of the things we do is our vision is to drive positive change in the organization. So we try to take advantage of existing resources like the Integrated Data Repository, I think what you were just referencing, at CMS. So this is a great resource of data at CMS that we do our analytical work on. In addition, we have internal resources to do our analytics work. So a big driver is to reuse shared services that the department offers, and we also have to build internal services, particularly shared self-service tools to allow particularly our auditors, evaluators, investigators, and attorneys to oversee the programs at HHS.
And I should probably clarify, by the way, I sloppily use the term Integrated Data Repository, which has capital letters in CMS right now. Mine is more of a lowercase integrated data repository because we're not part of the Medicare program, so we actually can't merge our data with Medicare. It's another challenge because of HIPAA and rules on access. People in Medicare can't look at our data because they have no business reason to. So to protect patient privacy, our data is separate, but we will have to build something out similar to what Medicare has thought its way through with claims data. We have to do that with enrollment data, but we will have some form of integrated data repository that will not be the capital IDR.
So one aspect of data management is interoperability. And Jason, how is the VA fostering that aspect, especially in terms of continuity of care?
So there are a couple aspects, one being our EHR modernization, where we're taking our legacy VISTA systems and moving into a modernized platform based on standards-based health data. So we would be able to have an entire ecosystem of FHIR-based APIs, so that way our data looks like any other health system's data versus having a medical diagnosis formatted in one way versus another, and then trying to connect this for some type of longitudinal record. You would then have to react to that customized data and actually build and account for it. Leveraging industry standards helps to provide a level playing field from a data analytics perspective. And through that also is the data transformation effort, which is taking our legacy information and every field, every status that would map to an industry standard, making that standardized. So as an example, the health records API that we launched officially in production in November, it provides up to 10 years of health records for our veterans, and that's 10 years of custom data, custom values, what we thought was pertinent field information or value 10 years ago. Who can remember? So there was a lot of effort across multiple partners to make that data Argonaut compliant for DSTU2.
The power of APIs.
Exactly.
How are, can you go into how partners are vetted into that program?
Sure. So for our developer portal, quick plug, developer.api.gov, anyone can go there and connect. Go for it. And within the portal, you can request a key. This key for the APIs is for our sandbox. So the first part of the vetting process is to connect with our sandbox, which has synthetic data, which was provided by the MITRE Corporation. So it's truly synthetic, meaning that it's modeled after real life scenarios, real life people, but it's fake data. But that way you actually have quality data to work with. So the potential partner has to go through integration with the sandbox to prove their business case, their technology innovation, and their model. And once they're ready, they can request production access, which requires a product demo to VA to prove their case, to show their API security in place. And at that point, if all the checkboxes are ticked, at that point they can get production access to the API.
So that kind of goes into the security aspect a little bit to discuss the other side of this panel, security. How is the Lighthouse program managing the security issues that come about some of the data management challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the idea of open data and to help provide technology innovation, but open data doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely open, that anyone can see it. So we do have APIs that, such as facilities APIs. Anyone can connect to the facilities API to see what's the address, the times, the hours, the contact information for a VA facility. That's just open to public. It's the yellow pages. However, the other side, such as PII and PHI, that is basically open data with consent. And so there are several layers of security that we have. One part within the platform itself is that our platform has the API gateway, which helps to monitor traffic and connection points, but also the platform is containerized. So it's not just one flat environment that if it's compromised, it's compromised. It's containerized so that way we're able to isolate individual events. It helps to actually provide scalability for organic growth and adoption and spurts for performance and resiliency. But in kind, it also helps to control security risks at that point because we can shut down a zone, we can shut down a container, and while anyone else who is valid and doing good things can still be connected, but we can isolate, nefarious people or entities. But then at the same point, we have several layers for the keys. So when you have your production API key, if I'm a developer and I'm connected to the production API, especially a PII or PHI API, that is a lot of I's in one sentence, which is very difficult. I should be proud that I did that on one cup of coffee. Just because I have production access, I still can't see data. I cannot see veterans' information. I have to obtain explicit veteran consent for that particular technology solution. So if I was technology component A and I wanted to provide this solution for a veteran, whatever the use case may be, and I have production access, I can't see anything until you provide consent, and in kind for technology provider B, they still can't see anything until you provide consent and you provide consent. So it's based off of an additional layer of access keys on the individual veteran for that particular technology solution, and also with refresh tokens and expirations, similar to health plans where, when you connect to your patient portal to see what type of claims and benefits that you have, and if you don't log into it after 3 months, you have to then re-authenticate. You have to re-authenticate as well, and that's the part within the individual veteran consent. We leverage the OAuth 2.0 security protocols to actually validate, the veteran validates that they are who they are and they are providing consent.
Robert, you mentioned a data catalog that you are working on. Go into that a little bit and how security is at play with it.
Sure. So one of our challenges with working with the department, which I think is 1.8 trillion in outlays, is there's a vast amount of data behind those programs. And the program owners have that data and we need to gain access to it. So the first thing we did through the efforts of our Chief Data Officer, Carol Prismakowicz, is she set up a data operations group. And they do the unglamorous work of capturing the data, putting the data catalog together, and making sure we have the security controls in place. In addition to that, we have set up an engagement committee. And what that does is it's just a process that anyone can set up. And through our 4 business units, our auditors, our evaluators, our attorneys, and our agents, the senior leadership comes together. We review work prior to it being engaged in. And part of that review is the data that they will need to do their work. And through that process, we can make sure, A, we have the data. If we don't have it internally, we can gain access to it externally. And this has been a great help for us to not only identify the data we're going to need, but make sure we have the appropriate security controls, because we also have all the I's, but we also have the law enforcement component too.
Jeff, so as a relatively new CMS enterprise, you have a unique data set in operation. What challenges do you face in going from a startup to a more mature data platform?
I think when we built it, some of the challenges we face now, we built a platform that is kind of a tangled mess of code because it was thrown together really quickly. And then again, a lot of things I would characterize as kludged onto it. So each one was kind of as something came up, you built a solution for it because you didn't have time. So it's really disentangling yourself from an existing code base and re-architecting it while maintaining stability. So, one of our primary driving directives is every year we have to deliver open enrollment. So you go through a phase of figuring out what kind of changes you can make that will move the program forward. And you actually may take a year where you're making a bunch of changes and none of those get exposed to a production system because it's the pre-work you're going to need to do as you convert everything over. So we went through a process of converting all of our eligibility to APIs from a tangled mess of like the website interacts directly with the services, directly with the database. Now we have a website, an API layer, and a data layer. We still do not have all the use cases for the application built into the streamlined application. So we got, I think, about 70% of people through the streamlined application this year. The year before, it was fewer than 50%. So those APIs have been out there for a while, but then you have to build your way into using them while maintaining your existing system until you are completely over the hump, because otherwise you're trying to do a massive switch and you could cause massive disruption in open enrollment. So it's trying to deliver the quality enrollment experience and improve it every year, but not take away what somebody already has.
Okay. Jason, so with open data, that presents its own set of security concerns. Discuss how your team is approaching that.
So I probably answered the question previously, but so within open data, it is the idea of what the data is itself. So it's the applied use case and the object of what that data answers. And so facilities information can be open data. It doesn't harm someone. It's information that's just open in general to the public. But having the like PII, PHI information available from an open perspective, a good way to have an analogy is it's similar to being a realtor and having an open house. It means it's open to the public, but you still have to go through a door. It doesn't mean that you knock down all the doors and all the windows and anyone can just breeze through and steal everything. You know, there's still security measures in place that are protecting the house, and it's by invitation that you go in, you know, to make sure that, you know, the realtor is making sure that no one is going through and stealing something or trying to do something. So it's a more curated sense of what open data truly means from that perspective.
I guess this is more of a general question as well for anybody to jump in whenever they would like. Why would you sacrifice security for efficiency?
Never. I think that you have an obligation. I think this is, you know, I can talk more in a little bit later on some of the things we're doing with the private sector, but one of the things I found in dealing with the private sector and trying to get them to a place where they can access our data is their concept of security is not the same as what the government has. Their concept of quality of delivery is not the same as what the government has. They'll throw something out there, and it's a different model. It is what it is, but if you're downloading apps on your iPhone, you should probably be aware of this, that they do not have the same security standards you're used to dealing with. They don't do ATOs. We have the responsibility to protect the security and privacy of the data. We are dealing with FTI, federal tax information. There are very high security standards that deal with that. We cannot compromise those. Legally, we cannot. If we were, there are criminal liabilities for that, but it's also just like, forget the criminal liabilities. You have a responsibility to the consumers whose data you've brought in. And CMS also has the Medicare program, the Medicaid program. We have over 100 million people's data, and this is really sensitive data. So the first priority is to take care of that. I think what you're really talking about is not efficiency versus security. It's more like having a risk-based approach to security where you're trying to move the business forward but not unnecessarily jeopardizing data. We can't live in a world where we lock everything down because we have to. You're opening up to the world. There is a risk that you're taking on when you do that, but you have to be very smart about that risk. So you can't be afraid of taking risks, but you cannot be neglectful of security in taking those risks.
Right. Well, and also to that point, from the risk-based decisions that we would make for a trusted partner, you know, as we're going through the product demo, or as they are going through the product demos to prove to us, like to VA, why this is a valid solution and use case, and here's our security protocols in place. I mean, there are a couple areas within, healthcare law, the Privacy Act, a patient's right to their own information, so technically a patient can share their information with whoever they want. From a legacy perspective, I can print out my health records and, well, of course, once they're on paper, everything's dead. But I could go into the street and throw it up in the air because for myself, I don't care. I mean, I'm 6'2"-ish. I'm fat, pre-diabetic, big whoop, but I don't care. Other people, it's sensitive information, so it's in a case-by-case perspective. However, we are still the stewards of veterans' data. So while we are empowering our veterans to be health data consumers in this new consumer direct data exchange, to your point, if we think that a potential partner has an ulterior motive, or potentially they do not have the best in practice security, we will provide feedback and say, well, you would need to make these changes in order to be connected to us truly. So it's part of the open dialogue. It's not so much that we even have like a flat yes or no. It's the dialogue to help also shape this new evolving technology ecosystem where the patients can now connect to their data and do something with it versus just printing it out. But we also have to be stewards for them as well.
And it's interesting you're talking about the balancing. I think, we're running a business here. We're trying to get millions of people enrolled in private health insurance, and we're trying to be as creative as possible so that we can make it as accessible as possible. You're balancing the obligation to allow people to have access to their information with the obligation to keep that information from falling into the wrong hands.
Right.
We're balancing the obligation to get people enrolled and open up as many channels as possible with the obligation to protect the information that we hold. So this is a constant balancing act that we have to take on, and that's why we proceed carefully. But we're also proceeding, it sounds like you're proceeding aggressively, I feel like we're proceeding aggressively, but not recklessly. And it is, you really have to be conscious of not being reckless with it, but not being afraid and being in the old world from the 90s where everything was locked in a fort and nobody could see it, because that's not our world now.
Right, exactly.
About 80% of our work involves CMS, and it's the claims data from Medicare and Medicaid. And we feel like it's extremely important to protect the beneficiaries. In addition, there's organizational reputation. If we can't protect this data, who is going to rely on the reports and the work that we do? So we think it's critically important that once we've received this data, we need to protect it.
There's, I heard a balancing act from one of you. Would you consider it to also be a balancing act?
Not in our area, no.
All right.
I think that's more of a traditional model. And there is plenty of places in CMS where there is a traditional model where you're just, I mean, you think about an accounting system or something, you're really locking that down. There's not a transparency requirement there. I think we're in a different world when we're directly consumer facing.
Okay. Let's see, Robert, what are the security challenges that you are dealing with, maybe in a little bit more detail?
Sure. So probably the biggest issue is we are not the system owners. So we, particularly on the claims data from CMS, which is, as I said, about 80% of our work, we have to ensure we're protecting those beneficiary claims data. So whether that's working within the CMS security domain or bringing that data within our environment, that is a huge challenge because it goes directly to reflecting the integrity of our reports that we issue and our law enforcement actions. So we have to make sure that we enforce those security controls. And we also hold CMS and the other components accountable for those same rules, so we need to follow them strictly.
Okay. So looking into your efforts that you have undergone so far, and maybe looking ahead into the next couple years, what is exciting, and maybe it's not so obvious as something like an API at VA, which is directly impacting veterans, but what is something that is very exciting that is on the horizon that would stem from some of these efforts that the end user, I guess, could immediately see an impact of?
Well, I think our exciting thing is where we've also gone to an API-based process to build out, to build this website, service layer, data layer construct. The service layer is now APIs, which means you don't just have to come to healthcare.gov. So where I've talked about exposing ourselves to the outside world, we've created APIs with a data exchange standard where somebody can stand up their own website, and this is getting back to the old way that private insurance was delivered before there was a healthcare.gov. You went to web brokers, you went to agents and brokers in the insurance industry, and we've had that demand on the table since we went live to go back to that old model and allow the private sector in a private insurance industry to let the private sector do their job and market this stuff and do very niche marketing. This year, but to do that, again, we had to have the same kind of standards. So we have audit standards, we have a set of security controls that we have to make sure that you can pass hundreds of security and privacy controls. And you have to have an independent audit of that, and then our auditors look on top of that, and we'll go back and forth until they meet that audit standard. And then we have business logic too, because the other thing we have to do is deliver an eligibility determination that people can take to the bank. When they come to healthcare.gov, they know they're getting that. If they go to somebody else's website, they have to have that same guarantee that they're going to get the same eligibility determination. So there's this whole oversight responsibility we have to deliver that. But the promise in this is, if you look at what happened this year, this was our first year that we rolled it out on a large basis, so we just called a startup year. And in a startup year, 30% of our enrollments came through what we call the direct enrollment process. Some of that is still going back and forth to healthcare.gov, but a good portion of it is directly through the APIs, through other websites. and the consumers that came through that process, we have 45% new consumer traffic, 55% returning through that channel. The overall average for all of open enrollment was 25%, which means if you came to healthcare.gov, fewer than 20% of the people coming direct to healthcare.gov are new consumers. So if you want to talk about the opportunity on the horizon, if you can scale that model and continue to deliver 45, 50% new consumers through this alternate traffic, and this was just a startup year, that actually takes us from a sustainability cycle to a growth cycle, which then offers the opportunity for rate reductions, expanded coverage, that kind of thing. So we see this as a really powerful model that we're using, and we're just getting started with it, and we're really excited about its potential to really deliver insurance to more people than we have been, and in more creative ways.
Yeah, and I think from a VA perspective, especially within the API sphere, for me, it's all about data. So being able to take our data and being able to provide some type of unified platform or entity, this thing, because as emerging technologies come on board, who knows what's going to be out in 5 years? You know, I would never think that APIs would be emergent technology within 5 years is just, you know, industry standard, and then in 5 years, who knows what's after that. But being able to unlock the data so that way our innovators, even within VA, there's a lot of good work across many of the offices across VHA to actually take that data to help improve value-based care models, to provide point of care decision points based off of existing data models. But then also what would be interesting is that as we identify use cases and data sets that could also help drive the external technology innovation ecosystem through the Lighthouse Developer Portal, actually see how our veterans as empowered health data consumers to see, okay, well, what are they connecting to? Who are our trusted partners? Who are they coming to? How are they using this data? What do our veterans want? It will also help shape from a bidirectional perspective, not just VA down through, you know, VHA to say, well, here's what we're doing, but it's also that conversation back to say, well, these are also the use cases we need that we can see through technology trends to also help shape healthcare from that perspective. So we truly have a bidirectional model of innovating healthcare.
Do you think there are any roadblocks to being innovative in government?
Well, I mean, people laugh.
Not a loaded question.
I think if you work with supportive leadership, no. So as long as leadership is willing to do it. But I think the other thing is, like when we implemented EDE, this enhanced direct enrollment process, we went into the previous open enrollment period, and the bets within the team were somewhere between 3 and 7 partners being live before open enrollment. We didn't hit that. We got 2 live at the very end of open enrollment and like a trickle of traffic through that, so it became at best a beta test of a new process. I don't think you look at that as like a barrier to innovation. If you want to innovate, again, you have this responsibility to deliver quality and keep the security in place. If we would have rushed, lowered standards, and had problems as a result of it, the whole project could get shut down as a failure. Instead, we kept the standards up and made people meet the standards, and then we delivered a successful project, and this year the success was demonstrated. So I think you don't need to rush into innovation. You have to be patient with innovation, but you have to constantly work toward it and grind away at innovation. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of work because of the responsibilities that we have as public servants, not because government itself is inherently flawed, but I think it's the responsibilities that we have to deliver quality programs and to protect data that actually make innovation go a little bit slower, but at an appropriate pace for serving our customers.
Yeah, and I think also it's just the nature of technology, where now technology is moving so quickly, where you even see across educational systems that there are more certificate programs versus actual, like degree programs, because technology is moving so fast. There are more, light frames of how am I going to, be be valid or certified in a specific field. So unless you are an entity that was developed new in this new or emerging world, it's just tech debt. So coming from corporate America across the PBM industry, you have mainframe here, MQ messaging and FileNet servers and, legacy web services that were hip and cool back when you saw dial-up and Prodigy.net, And so it's just connecting the data silos and then going through that, and from the connection, also making sure that data is clean. Someone dropped it earlier today during one of the pre-session, wrangling the data, and actually making computational and making it standardized so that way we actually have a good sense to move forward. It's not so much an obstacle, it's just the work that has to be done.
And it's quite possible that the APIs we're building today will be the tech deck of the future.
Exactly, because there will always be something new and better to move forward, and I hope so, because we just can't stay stagnant.
Right.
We have to move forward.
Great. So I want to open it up to the audience to see what you guys want to hear. Is there any questions before we move on?
I have one.
All right.
So
There's actually a mic being passed around.
I heard you mention a data model in some of your discussion there. So across the board, is there a desire for a common data model across healthcare or not?
So common data model for the industry or within VA specifically?
Industry at large. I mean, my tears, as I've talked with Colonel Scott in the past, were OMOP or Sentinel drive us to a common model. I'm not saying all data should be structured, but in the structured data that we have, if we talk in a common model, then the DoD and the VA can collaborate better, and I think across the market as well. But that's my opinion. I'm curious what yours is.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And we need a lot more time for this. But I think so there needs to be some type of common data set, of course, to drive the commonality of data exchange and understanding what that means. So I know like ONC had their final ruling as far as what is the U.S. core profile for information, driving standard fire standards from that perspective. But also at the same point, there are going to be nuances where I think there will be unique data models, especially with leveraging like AI technologies. Computers are defining new data models, and we have no idea how they derived this new algorithm or what have you, and yet it's a valid key data model and protocol to drive innovation forward. So I think it's both. There's going to be a common data set, but it can't just be a one solution fits all. There is going to be a hybrid solution. I'm always about hybrid. There's always a common path, and then you have to have some sort of flexibility in your approach for things.
And while we're using APIs now and maybe something else in the future, or maybe some blend of things, I think the defined information exchange standard, in the past it was X12, now it's APIs, but having a defined information exchange standard, having data definitions that are common across an industry, get you about as far as I think you want to get, because you don't know everybody's end use of the data. So a data model is always structured not around like us sharing data, but what am I doing with the data and what is Jason doing with the data? If it is something different, then we need to agree on how to exchange it, but we need a data model that is serving the end use of the data. So I actually don't think we should ever have a common data model. I think data models should be centered around end uses, one of which is I need to be able to talk to him. But it doesn't mean that I need to model my data exactly the same as him, because he's going to do different things with it. We don't even have a common data model between enrollment and payment within the exchange, because a payment view of enrollment data is a month-by-month snapshot of like how much do I owe you, and enrollment is a span that you have to convert to a payment view of that same data. So we remodel our own data because we have different purposes for it, but it's all integrated. So it's more the ability to communicate with a standard, I think, that is the most important.
All right. There's one more question.
Name's John Scott. I, until recently, worked at Defense Health Agency. And while there, I was involved in a lot of the collaboration work between DoD and VA and sharing information between the departments and with the private sector. My question's sort of organizational based. In the projects that you're working on with Lighthouse, to what degree are those being coordinated with what I'm more familiar with, which is the My Healthy Vet in the Office of Connected Care at VHA? Because we've been working with them to have interoperability of the patient-facing applications, and we think we're making some progress. But I didn't hear you mention much of what I know to be the capability of that platform.
Oh, so Lighthouse essentially serves as the front door for VA. So as we move forward with EHR modernization, and modernization like with My Healthy Vet and other offices across VA, it's not that like Lighthouse is actually working to build APIs per se, because not one team cannot build APIs for for VA. It's really helping to connect the partnerships to say, well, My Healthy Vet has technology, has potential APIs, other systems such as other databases and services would have potential viable APIs in a use case that we can then publish out. So for us, it's more about evangelizing and bringing forth data from that perspective versus us actually doing our own silo of work and then hoping it coordinates with something else, or then we have duplicative builds and everything. So, you're welcome.
Reassuring. Thank you.
So we are out of time, but thank you so much to these guys. Another round of applause for them. This was interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you very much to the panel. I appreciate it. Okay, so we have our second answer. We have our second winner for the trivia so far. So the question was, what was the % increase in ransomware attacks on healthcare institutions from 2018 to 2019? And the correct answer was 60%. So you guys, everybody was like way over. Somebody guessed 300%, which is a lot. So the winner was actually table 3, which was 86%. So Alex will be providing the tickets. I think I noticed some more people just joined that table. It's interesting. All right, so we have one last trivia answer, and this is actually going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a Valentine's Day themed question. So is everybody ready? Everybody got their pens and papers? All right, so the question is, before the Necco, am I pronouncing that right? Necco candy hearts were sold as candy, what did the inventor of the candy making machine intend it to be used for? So before the maker of candy hearts were sold as candy, what did the inventor of the candy making machine intend it to be used for? All right, 60 seconds are on the clock. A made-up clock. That's ticking in my head. James, you want to help grab answers?
Winners didn't hear the question.
Okay, excuse me. Oh, you were too busy gloating. All right, one last time. Before the maker of candy hearts, before the candy hearts were sold as candy, what did the inventor of the candy making machine intend it to be used for? Side note, the company that makes said candy hearts is out of business. So I guess you can buy candy hearts now, too. They did. You're right, actually. They're coming back next year, actually. All right. Who's got an answer? Brooke? Oh, yeah. Adam, you can't answer. You're on our team. You know the answer. Well, then he loses points for not paying attention. Okay. Here you go, James. Thank you very much, sir. And actually, James and the rest of our team, the researchers, are the ones that come up with these questions. So I can't take the credit there. So good job. All right. So we have our last interview, I should say. We're not calling them fireside chats as much anymore of the day. But thank you so much for everybody for staying with us this morning. Hopefully this has been really valuable. Before we wrap up, we have one of my favorite sessions of the morning. And it's actually with someone that was one of the first folks to join us for the CXO Tech Forum. So it's been really exciting to see how he's progressed in his career over the years. So our last piece is going to be our CIO highlight, and it's going to be with Health and Human Services CIO Jose Arrieta. He's going to be joined by retired Colonel Jason Windsor, who is Government CIO's Chief Medical Information Officer. Jose provides leadership and oversight of the department's $6.3 billion IT portfolio in support of the expansive mission to enhance the health and well-being of Americans, providing for effective health and human services and by fostering sound, sustained advances in science underlying medicine, public health, and social services. So if we could have Jose as well as Jason join us on stage, it'd be fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. All right, thank you, guys.
Great. Wow, great audience. So, as Michael said, I tried to get the fire pit here, a little table of scotch, and it just didn't work out, I guess. So, but this is
almost canceled when he said there was no scotch.
But this is supposed to be just kind of a general discussion with about 180 of our closest friends, okay? First of all, Jose, I wanted to thank you for coming out. I know the time that you commit to doing these things and sharing the information that the HHS is doing and the transformation that the CIO shop and the IT, health IT in particular for us has really been transforming. So one of the topics that I'd like to start with is obviously Accelerate. There's been quite a bit of discussion in other forums. You've given some other interviews about that. But it's the first blockchain-based program in the federal government that actually got an authority to operate. And its core node that supports the business and service layers adheres to the FAR. So it's got a lot of advantages going at it from that aspect, GSA's Category Management Initiative. I just want you to tell me and the group here a little bit more about the acquisition portal and your results at HHS.
Yeah, sure. So one thing about Accelerate that folks don't realize or just kind of dismiss is the fact that it really is infrastructure. So we're ingesting data, we're curating data, and we're creating mechanisms to share data, right? And that's really what the investment in Accelerate is. The first data set that we actually started to use that infrastructure for was acquisition data. And so we built microservices that are a representation of the planning aspects of the acquisition lifecycle. I do have an update. Last Friday, we actually awarded our first contract using a neural network that we actually built off of Accelerate. That neural network did a cluster analysis of about 10 years worth of contract spend. It read through terms and conditions and prices paid. And it gave us visibility into kind of price discrepancy across the portfolio. I'm not going to tell you the company, but we negotiated a deal with a company, and we're going to save $30 million over 5 years. It's about a 52.25% discount off of the rate that we were currently paying. We'll generate savings immediately in year one. That deal in and of itself more than pays for the investment that we made in Accelerate. And that was really kind of the idea behind Accelerate. Now, the blockchain piece of Accelerate, which we think is really interesting, we were just using it as an attestation layer. But we think that as we scale it and people start to want more access to the data, we start to create a behavioral record of the data sets that folks are accessing that's immutable. And then we think we can actually tokenize and start to nudge different behaviors across any portfolio. And so we've made a down payment on this infrastructure so that we can ingest, curate, and share data. We have a series of business services so we can transform unstructured, all open source. We can transform unstructured data sets into machine-readable data. And we think we have the ability to be really disruptive, really transformational. I never want to be disruptive. Really transformational from the perspective of how we deliver services. So that's the update. We have another deal that we are working on that we expect to complete sometime in April. And you know how the acquisition life cycle is. I mean, we may not hit our target in April, but we think there's over a $30 million savings opportunity there based on the insight that we have to the data set using HHS Accelerate. So it's going well. We're about 2 weeks behind the schedule that we set, not for the contract awards, but just for the development aspects of Accelerate. It actually no longer sits under me as the CIO, although I do have a large say in how it's implemented due to some federal laws and my own personal interest. But it's going well.
Well, I think in this sense, disruptive from an individual persona with disruptive technologies and stuff that's been talked about, I think is obviously a positive. Are there other ways that HHS is using blockchain for improvement of processes?
Yeah, I mean, there are use cases in HHS that are leveraging blockchain at the FDA. But I think more importantly, and somebody asked me about this the other day, it's the FDA RAPID program for anybody that's wondering. But I think more importantly, blockchain is infrastructure. It's not sexy. But it provides for an ability to do business differently. And it's not the entire technology stack. I mean, everybody just wants to talk about the blockchain. As I said before, it's just a thin layer of our tech stack, and we're using it as an attestation layer now, and we're using it so that we can nudge and encourage decentralized behavior in the future. There's a number of use cases that we see that could benefit the agency leveraging blockchain as the CIO I see. But it's things that will happen behind the scenes, and I don't know that it'll be something that everybody understands that we're actually doing. And I think that's the nature of blockchain technology. But from a return on investment perspective, we think that it is significant, and we think we've proven it with this first deal that we awarded last Friday.
Well, to the dismay of your staff, we were talking back. I'd like to go off script real quick with a question. Given my background trying to grow up as a clinician and learn more about acquisition and get the levels of certification to help when I was still in uniform, we talked about your background in procurement and the acquisition and procurement advances that HHS is making for its innovative movement. I want to give you a little bit of time to talk about those advances and the good work that's been going on from HHS at that.
Yeah, I think from a technology perspective, if you're buying technology, it's less about what you know. It's less about knowing every detail about how the technology functions and more about structuring a deal that will incentivize industry partners to actually deliver something of value and be interested in your program. And so if you look at what we've done with HHS Accelerate and what we're trying to do with some of the other programs, what we did is we went to the market and we said, look, I want to spend $150,000 on a proof. Now, if I went out and bought licenses to do what we did on our proof, it probably would have cost me $1 million. And there's no guarantee that it would actually work or drive any level of change. But I went and I spent $150,000. I did a proof with a small company. It becomes great past performance for that small company. It allowed me to test something and we determined that it would work. It allowed me to test a hypothesis that we believed in. And if you actually look at what we're doing next, we're then taking that model and we're saying, look, HHS Accelerate is ATO'd. The boundaries ATO'd, the way we want to do business is ATO'd, and now we want to actually scale it at an enterprise level. The infrastructure in particular, right? The infrastructure in particular, we don't care what application actually runs off the top of it. So we've gone to the market and said, look, if you're a large company that's investing 20% of revenue in R&D because you're scared that you're going to get bought out by a competitor or you're going to be extinct, come bid on this business opportunity. Because while it may be a drop in the bucket in the billions of dollars of revenue that you generate every year, this will be the first one in the U.S. federal government to actually deliver this type of infrastructure, and it becomes a selling point for you when you go and sell your product sets globally. So what we've tried to do is incentivize companies to kind of offer us value through the acquisition lifecycle, and I think that's the way that you actually approach industry if you want to generate as much value as possible. The neural network, the recurrent neural network that we built. Sure, could I go out and do business with a large company that has that capability? Yes, but it would cost a significant amount of money. What if I go to a university, or what if I go to a small business that pulls in university students and actually tests a recurrent neural network with an unstructured data set that I have? I give them access, I put them behind my firewall, and I let them prove my hypothesis. It's great past performance for that small business, great experience for those students. I get a quick understanding if it's going to work. I learn how to implement a TensorFlow capability, and then I turn around to the market and I say, hey, is there anybody out there that can help me scale this at an enterprise level? We think this is worthwhile in terms of an investment. That's how you fundamentally transform and change government, and that's the approach we've been taking. And that's why we've been able to do things so quickly. And I'm fine with the risk. I mean, I've done presentations like this, and I'm not picking on the front table, but you're right in front of me. I've done presentations like this and had people roll their eyes at the table like, that'll never work.
They weren't rolling.
And by the way, I won't say their name, but I remember the person's name. I remember where they worked. And every single time I see them, I tell them, I remember you rolling your eyes. Right? Merciless. Absolutely merciless with that person. He is not here today. But
he was, but we had to escalate.
But you have to be willing to take that risk. You have to be willing to take that risk, and I'm fine with it. I'm absolutely fine with the risk, and I'm absolutely fine with the tension it creates.
Perfect. Thank you for letting me segue that a little bit. Knowing the audience that we had, I thought that was going to be a good topic. So it's been a little bit more than a year now since the president actually signed the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policy Making Act. So how has HHS approached the Evidence Act within your business model?
Yeah, so I think that for those of you that know our ASPE organization, they have done a ton of work on this, and they deserve a lot of credit for the work that they've done. And so Evidence Act really has kind of three pillars to it, right? And I have a very specific interest in one pillar. So from one level, there's this discussion around privacy. When you interact with an app like Facebook or Instagram. You agree to share your data with them. And then that app is going to share that information with 3 or 4 different parties. That's their revenue model, and that's how they generate revenue. So when we think about sharing the health data within HHS, we have to understand the privacy implications, and do people actually understand what they're sharing? So there's a policy piece focused on that. The other leg of it is there is a large economic impact that sharing this data can have. If you look at the impact that GPS has had from an application perspective on the U.S. economy, it has been significant and created entirely new industries. And when you think about the fact that we have data, 100 million Americans, and Evidence Act says that you should share everything unless you make a decision internally not to share it. There's an economic boon from a policy perspective to actually sharing data if you can control policy. But the third piece, and the piece that interests me most, and this is the piece where the role of the CIO really becomes involved, is how do you do that? How do you create an API ecosystem to actually share data at scale across the department the size of HHS and that's as decentralized as HHS? How do you create the right security controls to actually share that data? Because the decisions that we make in terms of that API ecosystem, in terms of the security requirements that we want to impose upon the way that we do business, right? That's going to drive investment in private industry, and that's going to fundamentally change the way those applications are developed. So those are kind of the 3 aspects of Evidence Act. I would say we're at the point where we're having the discussion around the API ecosystem, how to think about that. That may not be a complex problem. I bet 10 of you could stand up right now and say, yeah, we know how to solve that problem. Have you solved that problem for an organization that has data on 100 million people? That's where the problem becomes very large.
Transfer to scope.
When you think about the scope of it. And then remember that whatever we articulate through solicitations and through policy as it relates to how we want to do business is going to have a huge impact on how that industry forms. But the CIO has never created policy historically. The CIO is there to ensure that the data that we're sharing is secure. The decisions you make and how you secure the data and manage that API ecosystem essentially will drive policy in the private sector marketplace that uses that data. So we're trying to start to think about it in those terms. And anybody that wants to come by and have that discussion, I'm very interested in that discussion and learning as much as I can about that, because I don't think that that's something that somebody that's internally focused, that's operationally focused, has had to really think about before at that scale.
And the sensitivity from a PHI perspective that people tend to be a little bit more restrictive on versus
I think
general PI.
Let's talk about the economic piece, but let's just talk about the economic piece. I'm going to pull the string on it for 1 second. So if you think about it, what does AI need to be developed? It needs data. And then you're going to build an algorithm, you're going to build a machine learning capability, and you need a bunch of data for it to learn. Well, what does that lead to? That leads to the development of new chips that can efficiently run those algorithms. You're talking about something that fundamentally will change industry. And I know of an adversary, and you can read this in The Economist, okay? And I know of an adversary that has the best facial recognition technology on the face of the earth. What does that give them? 1, they steal data as much as they can. 2, they label it. Who do they pay to label it? Very low-cost laborers in a very poor province within their country that just sit there all day and click on the noses of people and pictures. It trains their algorithm to actually understand facial recognition better, and that knowledge helps them make a chipset that can most efficiently execute that work. You're fundamentally working downstream and transforming the way that industry functions. So, when we start to think about sharing data, through a series of open APIs, we have to understand the economic impact that can have. And for everybody in this room that's interested in AI, be really interested in data labeling. Because nobody in the United States at least in the places I've been, nobody's ever talking about data labeling. But labeling data, I was in Las Vegas, this is a little sidebar, but I was in Las Vegas for CES. And the Uber driver, the Lyft driver, was complaining about the fact that the rates that she get paid have been lowered significantly, and she was saying $6 or $7. And I almost blurted this out, but my wife has told me to think before I talk. That's why you get married. And I almost blurted out, like, you're a cheap data labeling activity for Uber and Lyft, right? And there needs to be a robust conversation, in particular in health IT, around data labeling. because that's really what's going to drive competitive advantage.
Don't blurt that until you get to your destination.
Yeah, I didn't say it.
So for the final question, we again talked backstage a little bit. So we brought up several innovative techniques with the advent of blockchain, AI, RPA, machine learning, cloud, and other emerging technologies. How do you foresee change management within the HHS?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. From a change management perspective, look, tension exists. If you're going to change something, it's going to create tension. And I actually read this the other day. I was reading about the second law of thermodynamics Yeah, and I'm not an expert or a physicist, but I was reading about it, and the comment that the physics professor was making is that life is the most efficient form of energy, of moving energy, and so, and that creates like some level of tension and chaos, and you just have to accept that. So if you want to change something and you're going to put energy into it, right? You're going to move matter, you're going to heat, you are going to create tension. And if you sit there and you're afraid of tension, you're never going to change anything. So you have to accept the fact that tension will exist. You have to accept the fact that entropy will occur, that there will be significant amount of disorder. And how do you align incentives so that you can, in changing something and putting energy into change something, you can drive a certain outcome? And then you also have to accept the fact that there will be other residual outcomes that occur just because it's an efficient way for disorder to resolve itself. Right, and I'm fine with that. And if you can, but if anybody that thinks of themselves as a change leader, just accept the fact that tension will occur and live with it. And you can't develop consensus on change. Anytime you're focused, you're taking your energy away from one thing and you're focusing it on something else. You're not going to be able to develop consensus around that, and you just have to accept that fact. And I think that our approach to change management has been to create an experience for our workforce. So, I know we're out of time, but
we're fine.
So here's the example. I remember played basketball many years ago when I was thinner, and I remember every single play from a game-winning shot that a guy on our team made. I can tell you the exact play. It was a high screen and roll. The guy jumped on the high side of the screen. I flipped to the other side. They jammed the screener, and he ended up hitting a game-winning shot. Why? Because I experienced it. Because I was in the moment. Somebody wasn't telling me what to do. Somebody wasn't talking to me. I was in a situation. I was a part of that play. I can remember the numbers of the jersey. I can remember what hand he got on the ball. I can remember every aspect of it because I experienced it. So if you're going to try and drive change, accept the fact that tension will occur between two parties and try to actually create an experience for the folks that are involved in that change. And that's how you can actually solidify and get change to actually be digested within a large organization. And if you're not comfortable with tension, then don't try to change anything, because you're really just you're gonna spin your wheels.
Well, the only constant is change,
and change comes with conflict. Anybody that's married knows that.
Well, I think you guys are on a great path with your change management, and you at the helm as the leadership. So thank you very much for taking the time and sitting down and chatting as our closure. And I promise next time, a little scotch.
Okay.
All right.
Deal. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you, guys. Excellent. All right, so that wraps up our Digital Health CXO Tech Forum. But before we go, we do have one more trivia answer and tickets to hand out. So unfortunately, we haven't had this yet, but unfortunately nobody got the answer correct. And since it wasn't a closest question, we're going to do a random drawing. You are going to pick the winner. All right, so there were a couple that were kind of close. So the answer was lozenges. So a lot of people got close with antacids, a lot of antacid guesses. Vitamins. Say again?
It counts as a pill, right?
Some people said pills, but we felt like some people just said medicine. We felt that was a little bit too generic. So we thought the fairest thing to do would be to do a drawing. So you are going to pick. Just pick? All right. Do you want to read?
Table 11.
And you didn't even pick your own table. All right, table 11 wins the tickets. Andy, my esteemed colleague, Andy Andrew, will be handing them out. All right, so thank you very much for everybody for joining us. Our next CXO Tech Forum is going to be focused on digital transformation. It's going to be here as well, another morning event on May 14th. So we'd love for everybody who's in attendance today to join us. We're going to again have quite a few really esteemed folks across all the federal agencies take part in it, where the focus is really going to be digital transformation and digital services. All right. Well, thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks.